Welcome to the Men's Mental Health Podcast with your host, Dr. Daniel Bates, licensed professional clinical counselor, educator, researcher, and longtime advocate for men's mental health. Each episode, Dr. Bates unpacks the science of men's mental health, from addiction, help-seeking, and male depression to culture and masculinity. You'll hear interviews with leading scholars and candid conversations with everyday men who've struggled and overcome, with insights drawn from Dr. Bates' 15 years of clinical practice serving men in Kentucky and Ohio. Whether you're a professional, a partner, or a man searching for practical tools, this show delivers evidence-based strategies you can use right now. No jargon, just real talk. Let's redefine what real strength looks like. Let's dive in.
Just want to say welcome and thank you so much for doing this. I'm really, really excited.
Well, thanks for inviting me and for your thoughtfulness about my tricky last name. And as I said before, it's not as simple as Smith. It's not as easy as Smith. So thanks so much, buddy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I also want to say too, my agenda for this interview is kind of twofold. Selfishly, I just want to get to know you better and just hear about your story, hear about your history, what drew you into the field, your research interests. I want to get to know you better because I respect you so much and I love your work and just also the way you carry yourself. So that's one part of what I want to do today is get a better sense of your history. And then I also really want to dive into your research, what you think about counseling, psychotherapy, mental health care with men, some of the cutting edge research with positive masculinity, and just kind of do a deep dive with all those interesting research, nerdy type questions. So if that sounds okay with you, I'm going to just kind of jump in first with a couple questions just about your early life history. What was life like for you as a child? What kind of family did you grow up in? Conversations I've had with you before, I remember you making several comments about your father and what you thought about him. And those kind of stood out to me too, of like, oh, I wonder what Mark thinks about men and some of the father type figures in his life. So I'll stop talking and hand the mic off over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Daniel. I was born and raised in New Jersey. In my early years, I lived in an immigrant neighborhood of Slovak families. And at that time, we were really in straits. My dear late father had to drop out of school in the 8th grade when he was a boy because he had a tragic childhood. I won't go into all the details, but except to say that it placed him in a socioeconomic disadvantage for much of his life. And in spite of that, he was the finest man I've ever known. And my mom was a wonderful mom. And they did everything they could to give us better lives than they had. And my dad had an everlasting impact on me because he had a severely, badly injured leg that was never mended properly. And he would limp down the street to factories and other jobs, working in horrible conditions that eventually crippled him due to his efforts to provide for his family. And yet he never complained. He was always guided by the belief that he would give us a better life than he had. And my mom was inspired by the same value. So as you can imagine, when I later became a psychologist and I started specializing both in my clinical work and then later as a researcher, I started to focus on boys, men, and masculinity. And I realize now that a lot of that was at first unconscious, right? It was inspired by my love for this man and my belief that, symbolically, by helping boys and men symbolically, I was helping him. And I've never, I still am inspired by his example and by colleagues like you whose work on positive masculinity and who are on top of all the cutting edge developments in men and masculinity inform what I do and just impress me. So that's a little bit about my background and how it took me to where I am today as both a counselor and a psychologist.
Yeah. Okay. So much to dig into there. And so much of your story, I feel intersects with me, maybe in some different kinds of
Mm,
ways. I had kind of a more complicated relationship with my dad, but I was intensely fascinated by him too. I wanted to figure him out. So, Mark, you said something that kind of stood out to me is you started working as a psychologist with men and boys, trying to understand them, and maybe there was kind of a motivation there. I want to help these men, and by extension, maybe reach into the past and help my father. What help do you think that your father needed that he didn't get? Was it the physical and the leg, or it sounds like there was more than that you were trying to understand about your dad?
There was so much going on. He was born in poverty in the neighborhood. English was a second language. I now I now know that he had a learning disability, but in the 1930s, those were not diagnosed, right? There were no categories of learning disabilities. His dear mother died when he was 8. His father was an alcoholic who neglected him. And my father basically raised himself and at age 14, he had a horrendous leg injury in a football game that that after 2 years of different surgeries and all sort of painful rehabilitation left him with one leg, an inch and a half shorter than the other. And
Hmm.
then he had to drop out of school after only an 8th grade education and worked in horrible conditions on that leg. So he really he needed 2 things. One, it's made me acutely aware of poverty and its impact on people's health, right? If my
Mm.
father had perhaps had higher quality healthcare, which is available to most people of better financial needs, perhaps his leg would not have been bad. Perhaps he would have had teachers and in those days, they did not have elementary school counselors, but professionals who might have said to him, "Don't drop out of school, right?
Mhm.
Stay in school." As my father said to me, "Go to school and learn." Right? No, nobody said that to him. His exploitive father convinced him, "Oh, drop out, go to work, support your family." While
Hmm.
that father, while my grandfather was not supporting his own child. Uh,
Hmm.
so you know, I have this acute awareness about
Mhm.
the importance of trying to address the holistic needs of children and because of my father in particular, boys and most especially boys who are at risk.
So, and I'm just curious about that with the learning disability and then with the health issues that just couldn't get resolved. Did he did he ever become bitter or angry or isolated, walled off? It sounds like he still was someone you respected and sacrificed, his time to, provide for his family, but it doesn't sound like he got mean and nasty and bitter and angry.
Yeah, and that's part of why I just adore the man
Hmm.
and idolize him, and also am fascinated and amazed at what he accomplished. Because he and my mom had 5 children, and at one point, they brought in my cousin whom we consider to be another sibling, and he raised us all, and we all went to college, in spite of all the hardships and the barriers that he faced, and, they gradually somehow made it happen, and he was I think it's clear to say that he was never bitter. His response to everything was I mean, Daniel, I'll never forget this moment. When I was around 22 or 23, my father was recovering from having his left hip replaced, and he was on leave from work, and he was doing a little recaning of some furniture, and I happened to say to him, "Dad, how did you do it? How did you overcome all of that?" And my dad was a very quiet man. He rarely, if ever, talked about his hardships. He rarely said anything. He just led by example, but he did answer that question. And to this day, I'll never forget it. He said, "Mark, it was tough when I was a kid, but I always lived for the day when I would have a family of my own that I could love and give a
Mm.
better life than I had." Right? So, so part You know, as I've reflected on that, I've often thought of Adler talking about
Mm,
fictional finalism, right? This guiding image that people can create in life.
mm,
And there have been similar ideas expressed in numerous models of counseling and psychotherapy. And for my dad, that was helpful to him. And I also think that to some degree that interacted with his temperament and something that he was genetically wired to for persistence.
mm.
I feel very strongly that we should not ignore the influence of genetics. And in my dad's case, I think that he was born with something that was combined with this vision that he created as his solution for how to get through what he had to get through. So,
Yeah,
and I am the, you know, I am the I have benefited from that. Um,
yeah,
my brothers and sisters, we have benefited from that.
right. Well, it just sounds like he's kind of the model of resilience, right? Like with every blow, he kept going, and he had a very positive vision for the future. And maybe he wouldn't be living in the lap of luxury, but at least he could. Makes me think of some of the literature and discussion around prosociality, but he could set his family up for success. If not him, my family up for success. And so I there's something really powerful about that self-sacrificial way, and it kind of goes back to Adler's idea of like social interest. You've got Adler on in my
Mhm.
brain now, and I know Adler thought being connected and in harmony and working for the good of your community, that social interest was a key part of mental health. And so I think it sounds like your dad's story is a great case example of that. Even though he had some plaguing health issues and low SES and not able to kind of realize his dream educationally, he could still be happy and joyful and mentally healthy because he was working for the good of his family and his community. So yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, he has become an inspiration to countless boys and men that I've counseled throughout my life because I've
Wow.
told them about my
Mm,
dad's story, and
mm,
and boy, it triggers such amazing conversations with my clients.
yeah,
Some will say, I had a dad like that, and it helps them to remember him as they work through challenges that they face. And I've had other men who, like you mentioned, their relationship was much more complicated. And they find it inspirational to hear, wow, somebody can go through terrible experiences like your father did and come out the other end a decent person.
right.
You and I have a colleague named Ron Levant, a major legend in the psychology of men and masculinity, and he recently published a memoir on his relationship with his father, which was
Hmm,
a very painful relationship. And he once said to me, Mark, you and I have the same goals when it comes to helping boys and men, but we've gotten there through very different routes, right?
hmm.
So for some men in our field who are dedicated to this and women who are dedicated to this, their approach is in many ways the way my father approached parenthood, right? They want to overcome and do something better and make it better for others.
Yeah,
And
I was
that is equally inspiring when I meet colleagues who
yeah,
have done that. And I've written about the qualities of positive masculinity, and that's been an important contribution. I'm proud of that. At the same time, I'm glad that the writings of people like Ron and Gary Brooks, and of course Jim O'Neill with the gender role conflict literature, that all has helped me to understand that there are masculinities, right? And we as professionals have an obligation to learn about these very forms of masculinities and how they affect male behavior, and as a result, how we have to adjust what we do in counseling and psychotherapy with men.
yeah, yeah. I appreciate you going to the broad and the general. All research is me search. I'm sure you've heard that term. And it does kind of make me think of object relations approach to therapy is, that those initial experiences with my father as kind of a primary caregiver and the father figure kind of creates a template in terms of how I see future relationships or how I view men
Mhm.
broadly.
Yes.
And so, I think very similarly, I kind of had to go on a journey of healing myself too. And then kind of fast forward, I think it was 2018, 2019, your colleague, Matt Inglar Carlson, with
Mm.
I think 15 other authors, published the APA guidelines for working with men and boys. And so I've had conversations with Matt where he was kind of sharing some of his experiences when they published that. It was just this really multi-year long labor of love to really put the you know final polish on this thing and get it out there. And then it was just an avalanche of kind of ideological attacks and criticism. And so he shared with me of like, I don't know if I really understood all that. That wasn't really my intent to kind of critique masculinity, but it was more to put a spotlight on things and get the conversation going and conceptualize how we can work better with men and boys and try to give folks like a map and a pathway for delivering better care. And I remember myself when that was published, just as a clinician out in the field, kind of thinking, I'm just curious about that question. Is masculinity problematic and toxic and dark? And is this document really supporting that? I didn't get that sense when I read it, but it did open that question for me of, is it unidimensional or multidimensional masculinity? Are there a lot of different aspects to it? And very similar to kind of what you said, Mark, is I think all the research from James O'Neill, Levant, all of that research that does demonstrate, gender role conflict with Levant's research on the conformity to masculine norms, where there are aspects of domineering, seeing like a low view of women or kind of a negative view of homosexuals or things like that, or kind of maybe even like a sexual entitlement. I don't see those as like you have a bias, but like it's shining a light on something that's there. And I see your research as, okay, what else is there?
Right.
Is there a light to shine on other aspects? And so we need the complete picture. I guess that's my
Mhm.
view. I guess I'm kind of jumping to the research topic. I want to go back and hear more about your history, but I guess that's kind of my perspective. It sounds like it aligns with yours. Is we're shining a light on multiple dimensions or multiple aspects of what masculinity is, which contains that dark side and contains things like generative fatherhood and positive masculinity and those kinds of things. Do you have any thoughts on that or anything else to add? I'm curious your perspective.
Sure, a few things. So commenting on a couple points you made, I was part of the team that wrote those guidelines, and I distinctly remember one long weekend. The division, I should say, the task force got money from APA, and it funded Ron Levant, Matt Engler Carlson, Fred Rabinowitz, and I to work together in California, trying to get sort of a main draft of this together before it went out through all of the different divisions of APA for comment. And I do remember, as I was working on that, trying to influence a group. There were, I think it was close, there were over 30 of us when all was said and done, when this thing was finally finished. But I remember trying to influence the group to say, I acknowledge and affirm all of these issues, much of which had to do with toxic masculinity, be included here, but you're missing something. And
Hmm.
and there are pieces of it that include the more positive, strength-based perspectives on boys and men. So like you, when it was finally produced, I thought it gave a fairly balanced view, and yet after it was published, I remember reading, in particular, if you just Googled did a Google search, she found that there were lots of people in lay audiences, and I think in particular in men's rights groups who
Mm,
interpreted it a different way. And it those reactions, I think, point to the challenge that we face and how what are the experiences of those men? How do we empathize with them and how do we engage them? And I think of a similar challenge when I think about uh, the so-called manosphere and some of the people who are active in that. How do we understand these different perspectives and how do we engage in it in a way that is as much as possible productive? So these are things that go through my mind, and it's part of just an ongoing challenge through my whole career.
mm,
Whenever somebody tries to write about boys and men, you'll have groups that if you write something positive, they say you're anti-feminist, which is not the case, right? And you have others where if you write about the toxic masculinity, they'll say you're anti-man, you're against
mhm,
men, and both conclusions are just not accurate.
right,
But there's somebody else's interpretation, and part of our challenge then is how do we engage people who have those interpretations?
right. Yeah, I don't even know how to respond because you brought up such a great point. Yeah, how do you make sense of that? Is it just an overreaction that people have? If you were to write about or speak about, positive masculinity, and we should get into that too and discuss what your view is on that. But if you were to write about that, it sounds like you would get a lot of critique of your diminishing the role that men have played in all these societal ills and what about domestic violence and abuse? What about the murder rate? Who are the folks primarily filling our prison system? Men. Um, who are responsible for all the carjackings and all the assaults? Men, 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 right? Who occupy all these positions of political power and make all these kind of unilateral decisions? Men, 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 men. So then if you come along and say, "Hey, I'm researching this particular dimension of masculinity that's health promoting and positive and all those kinds of things," and you get that negative, challenging critique, I feel like you've provided a model for me in many ways of how to navigate it in a way that doesn't go to war with that critique and that challenge. But I'd like to hear it from the horse's mouth. How do you navigate those moments? And the other thing too is from my perspective, I see you building bridges with the other side, so to speak. As not that there actually is another side. But I'll stop talking and let you respond.
Sure. So in my professional addresses on this, when I've been giving a workshop or an invited address or in my publications, I make sure to begin by acknowledging that men are the perpetrators of many of our social problems in the world, right? And you mentioned them, so I won't repeat them, but you're right on target. These are the primary perpetrators of these offenses are men, and I am dedicated to trying to address those. And so I think when I've taken those steps, it wins part of potential, part of it engages some people who otherwise might not be interested in what I have to say. But by putting that out there at the beginning, they realize, okay, this guy does understand that there are problems. The other thing that I keep in mind is that going back to what I said earlier is that there are some people who have very, very strong transference, negative transference issues about boys, and it becomes quite a filter for how they interpret what they read, right?
Yeah.
So, and we know as psychologists, what's the term? Confirmatory hypothesis
Oh,
bias.
confirmation bias. Yeah.
Yes,
Confirmation
confirmation
bias.
bias.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you seek out data that support. It's sort of a
Right.
natural tendency, right, for us to seek out data that supports our pre-existing view. So I know, regardless of transference issues, that can
Mhm.
occur, and I think that confirmation bias is intensified due to transference issues. But
Mm.
then there are also other factors, such as just if you happen to be in a circle of boys and men who will punish you for acknowledging anything different, right?
Mm.
Who pressure you to stay within certain norms and never deviate from it. And
Yeah.
and I must say, in some very extreme cases, brainwash people
Mm.
into a very rigid kind of thinking, for which the person is ingrained with this reflexive response to not consider anything else, right?
Yeah.
So all of these things go through my mind, and when I deal with people's reactions to some of the things I've written about, I am sometimes usually able, to what degree are one or more of these influencing how the person's reacting to me?
Mhm.
And how can I respond in an empathic way, as well as a clear-headed and strong way when I have to, right? So it's a tricky challenge, but I think it's a very fruitful to take on the challenge, because we need dialogue, and we need persistent dialogue, and this willingness to return to conversations where people with whom we have differences of opinion. And we certainly see too much evidence of that throughout our society today. I won't get off into political debates, but we see the same thing there. And on the subject of men and masculinity, it holds there too. So
Yeah.
that's one of the challenges I face. And I look forward to continuing to wade into the waters on those matters.
You don't have to make a political statement one way or the other, but I think it's a great observation on your part to say there is a political, ideological discussion going on that does seem to either influence or impact the research in some ways. I don't know what specific ways I'm thinking about, but in my mind, it's you know, the ultimate purpose of science is the pursuit of truth. So whether
True.
it
Yes.
happens to favor men or disfavor men, I don't care. I find that secondary. I just want to know really what's going on. But we do have this kind of very politicized ideological kind of conversation going on, which I do think maybe influences the way we're formulating our research questions or if something gets published. So I'm just aware of that, and I think that when those guidelines were published, it seemed like it set off a firestorm that touched on that political ideological narrative and dialogue that was going on.
It became
It
a
was really something to
flashpoint.
behold. Yeah,
Became
yeah,
a flashpoint, but it also has been a valuable tool to help people figure out, to understand men better, and to figure out how to help them.
yeah. Absolutely. I know it had an impact on me, and it actually got me interested in these topics. I don't think I was really that interested in them before, and at that time, again, I was just a clinician out in the field, so it really wasn't something on my mind at all. And then the big firestorm happened, and now I'm asking myself questions and curious about things, and I read the guidelines, and it just got me going a totally different direction that I probably would not have gone without it. So
Mhm.
I'm oddly thankful for it because it just caught my attention and put things on the radar for me that hadn't been there. Okay, so we're jumping all over the place, and that's totally fine because I'm just loving the conversation so far. But I want to kind of go back to maybe your intellectual history and what got you into your research interests. And so, going back, what initially prompted you to look at the strengths in men rather than what is broken, or
Yeah.
being influenced by a deficit perspective?
So, my first job, so I decided to take a couple years off between undergraduate studies and graduate studies because I had this sense I wanted to work with troubled teenagers. And I thought I ought to get some experience. And indeed, I did for 2 years. I was a mental health worker. In many other places, it's called mental health technician, which is a bachelor's level
Mhm.
position on an inpatient adolescent psychiatric unit in a private hospital in New Jersey.
Mm.
And we had 16 kids on the unit, and about half of those kids were boys, and maybe a third of the boys were sort of aggressive, hyperactive, impulsive, sometimes delinquent, sometimes substance use disorders, oppositional defiant, conduct disorder. They were sort of in that continuum of externalizing behaviors, as well as guys who had a lot of difficulty, some of whom were in that sort of proud behaviors, as well as other guys who were depressed and anxious, but all of whom didn't respond to th- the the techniques of counseling inquiry that most people were taught. And in their
Mm.
frustration with these boys, many of my coworkers just wanted to throw them out of the hospital. And I was determined to figure out how to connect with these boys and get them to open up. Now, I had not had any graduate training yet, right? So I was going on what I learned by having worked in factories, by surrounded primarily by lots of men, playing sports, being around with lots of different boys and men. And and I just tapped into what I knew about how boys and men make friends, and I used that, like, you know, playing basketball and talking while you're playing, or wrestling with each other, or listening to tunes and talking about the tunes. And this was before this we're talking about 1980 to 1981 back, right? So we didn't have these video games that kids have today. But we had these ways of guys just relating to each other, and I found that I got these guys to trust me. I could
Mm.
talk them down from picking up a chair and smashing a window, or literally breaking their fingers and knuckles because they're about to punch it through drywall. And that always amazed me
Wow.
when a teenager could be so angry that they could punch their fist through drywall, right? And I could get these guys to de-escalate, and I could sort of see them when they were a volcano about to erupt, and I would take them for a walk or basketball or get out a
Mm.
guitar and sing a song and get them to react to it. And they opened up their worlds to me. And then when I started graduate school, I realized that much of what I was observing in veteran clinicians and much of what they were teaching us did not fit with the relational styles of boys and men. So every paper I wrote in graduate school, shouldn't say every, but most of them were dedicated toward a different piece to the puzzle.
Huh.
For example, I wrote a paper on behavioral family therapy with aggressive adolescents, and cognitive behavioral therapy with aggressive boys, and then cognitive behavioral therapy with boys who are hyperactive. And I began to find deep in those papers anecdotes about, okay, we sort of knew this worked, but when we did some post hoc analysis, what were the qualities of the clinicians who were most effective? And I found that much of what I mean, the other thing I didn't say before about what worked with the boys in the hospital was busting each other's butt, right? Good nature,
Mhm.
ribbing of
Mhm.
each other, joking around, horsing around. I was beginning to find that there were some clinicians out there who had these insights that were guiding their
Mhm.
work. And I also became interested in teenage fathers because when I was working as a clinician years later, while I was finishing my doctorate, and then after I had my doctorate, I found that there are all these services for young mothers and very few for young fathers, and all sorts of biases and misconceptions about young fathers.
Mm,
And I began to immerse myself in trying to figure out, has anybody figured out how to engage these guys? And sure enough, there were, and there were some notable exceptions to common practice, and those exceptions showed that when you employed the kinds of strategies that I mentioned earlier, and took a very strength-based affirming approach, and took your time and tried to relate to boys and young men according to their relational styles, that you're going to win them over
right.
and that you'll keep them. You'll
Hmm,
keep them and they'll come back to you and they will buy into what you're selling and they will accept your challenges, right? Because they
hmm,
know now this guy understands me. This guy can help me crack my cork, you know, and pour out
mhm,
what's inside of me and he's going to be there for me. So that
hmm.
one experience kept fueling the next, and I started writing about it, and I started to find that there are more and more people who are out there who said, "Wow, we want to hear more about this." So
Yeah.
it just gained momentum, and I'm still doing it. Still
Yeah.
doing it.
So Mark, it really started with a clinical observation or a clinical experience that led into or influenced your research focus. Is that right?
Yes, and unconsciously this transference, right? That like this unconscious need to make a difference in boys' lives
Hmm.
because what how different would my father's life have been if somebody had helped him, right? So I wasn't
Yeah.
aware of it at the time, but I have no doubt that that kind of fueled reach to the boys. Part of it was, you know, growing up as I did, I identified with underdogs. This identification with the underdogs, identifying with underdogs, trying to advocate on their behalfs, this unconscious influence of my father, and then seeing
Mm,
how boys were treated and often misunderstood, in spite
mm.
of clinicians' good intentions. All of that coalesced to inspire me in a very committed way.
Right. Well, I just have to tell you the story of my very first clinical experience. I worked with adjudicated youth in the juvenile justice system, and I did in-home family therapy. And
Mm.
I got assigned my very first case, and it literally took me a month to get connected with this family, and every time I showed up at their house, they weren't there. I'd call them, and they'd say, "Yeah, come on, we're here." And so it was just a month, and this was, like, my only case too, so I was just, like, desperate for referrals, and these were just my only people I was referred to, so I was all in, trying to get the session. And it was important for this kid's probation too. Like, he had a lot of skin in the game and a lot of things riding on starting the therapy up with me. So I finally got the session. I'm sitting on their couch, and I'm sitting across from a dad and the son. And I pull out my notepad. I get all comfortable, situated, and so I look at him and I say, "Okay, so what should we talk about?" And he just crosses his arm and says, "I'm not talking to you." And I said, "Oh, okay. All right. Well, tell me why." And he said, I'm not gonna talk to you." And I said, "Oh, man, please talk to me."
This was the father or this or this
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 was
was
the
the father or
son.
the son?
This was the
Ah,
kid. This was the kid who either he did this therapy with me or he was gonna get a pretty severe consequence legally. And so he just kept saying he's not gonna talk with me, and so I finally said, "Well, why? Truly tell me why. I can leave, I'll just go. Just tell me the honest truth." And he said, "Because you look like a counselor." And I was like, "Oh, well, I am a counselor." I had a button-up shirt, I was wearing khakis, and, I had kinda business type shoes and had my pad of paper. And so from that day forward, whenever I worked with a family, I just showed up in my street clothes. I didn't pull out the pad of paper, and I never sat down and said, "Okay, what are we talking about today?" I walked with them through their house and I looked at their nice big screen TV or their DVD collection and, made comments on what movie preferences they had. But it just radically changed the way I worked with families, but it also radically changed the way I work with males because there was this initial, I don't want to say opposition, but distrust of therapy and therapists. And so I recognize there's a thing in the room that has to do with men and boys and maleness and masculinity that if I'm not aware of it, it will just continually create a barrier to connecting and engaging with this client and making any kind of headway and progress on therapy. And so I got to identify what that thing is, whatever it is. So very much aligned with what you're saying. I think I had to learn male relational patterns as a therapist and then discover them in therapy and use them in therapy and then start connecting with boys and men. So it very much similar to you, it was a clinical experience and a clinical observation and my own history that got me interested in masculinity research and particularly your research. And so I think you had a paper in 2008 or 2009, but I think it was your 2010 paper with Dr. Inglar Carlson. I think it was the accentuating positive masculinity. That's the paper that really, well, I think I got that title wrong, but it was accentuating and affirming something in that title, in that vein, boys and men. And I think that was the paper, that was kind of a landmark paper, I think. Am I right about that?
Mhm. Yes, that has been cited hundreds of times, and, Matt and I so we had written earlier I had written earlier, actually, before I even knew Matt, in the Handbook of, Psychotherapy with Men. I wrote a chapter on working with school-age boys, and it was there where I started to lay out how we have to approach things differently, and then by the grace of God, I met Matt, and I found a brother, who thought like I did, and then we published that paper in 2010, which has been cited hundreds of times. And what we basically argued in the paper is that, and we've since added different, we argued that there are certain aspects of positive masculinity, males' way of relating, males serving as protectors and providers, male
Mhm.
humanitarian service, respect for, in later publications, respect for women, right? And we talked about how
Mhm.
the starting point for working with boys and men is trying to look for, identify, and affirm these qualities in boys and men, and the odds are they will trust you. And then you can bridge from that to other things, but
Mhm.
start there. So I'm very honored that, that it influenced your thinking, and I do have to say that I have to give credit to a lot of those pioneers who work with teenage fathers who reinforced and further informed my own thinking, because as I mentioned to you in 1980
Mm.
and 81, I was just doing what came naturally to me. But then
Mm.
when I became interested in these teenage fathers, and I found the literature on a handful of successful demonstration projects, I found out that they were basically saying, "Mark, you're right. And the way you need to do this is get out of your office, walk side by side, share a
Right.
drink and a bite to eat, toss a ball, almost be like a commando willing to go out and into the forest."
Yeah.
Uh, all of these non-traditional ideas, and I was fortunate
Right.
that when I worked in that hospital, we had a gym there. We had an outdoor basketball court. We had the capacity to go downtown and go for walks with these boys.
Hmm.
Then when I would start working in other places, I would bring a Nerf ball or a small football with me, and always had snacks or these little juice boxes, and go outside and just take the time There was an article, one of the greatest titles I've ever seen, Father Work in the Crossfire. And I think you
Hmm.
and I might have talked about this before. It was by a sociologist, Rudy Hernandez. And here's a Latino who wanted to go out and study Chicano teen fathers in the major cities in Michigan. And he
Hmm.
found when he first started, they would not come to see him and they would not talk to him. And
Hmm.
then when he got out in his office and he was engaging with this guy as he's repairing his car and another guy while he was working on his furnace. The guys started talking extensively about their experiences, about barrio life, and all of these things said to me, yes, this is what
Hmm.
we have to do. And we have
Hmm.
to take our time and be patient and persistent as you were, right? You didn't give up. You gave this kid this message. I want to learn about your world. I'm not going to rush you. I know the courts are putting the pressure on you and me, but I'm going to figure out a way for you to come to me in your time. And sometimes you don't have that luxury, but you won the guy over, right? It was a tough situation you were being. Those are not easy situations. So I give you a lot
Hmm.
of credit for that.
Yeah. And I'm just so curious, and I'm very grateful for you and Matt connecting too. Like, how did the two of you find each other? Because I think you and Matt are just like this dynamic duo who have produced so much, and it again so foundational, informative for my thinking. What just a shared interest? You crossed each other's paths. How did you start that conversation of, hey, let's start working together on this subject?
So two things were coinciding. His dad, John Carlson, had gotten funding from APA to produce a number of psychology videos.
Wait, is
And
his dad
John,
the John Carlson?
yes, that's his dad,
No.
the late John
No.
Carlson. Yeah, a
Weird.
legendary, prolific writer.
Oh, I had no idea. Oh my gosh. I'm
Yeah,
embarrassed. I had no idea
yeah,
he's the son of that
yeah,
John Carlson.
yeah. So John, so two things were happening simultaneously. John had recruited me to do a video on parenting boys,
Oh.
which was produced and recorded at Governor's State, where John was a professor, and then subsequently John got a contract from APA to do a series of videos on psychotherapy. So he
Oh.
contracted me to do one on positive psychology / positive masculinity
Hmm.
with men. Simultaneously, Matt was in graduate school and interested in men's issues and got involved in Division 51, where I had been a president and was chairing the fellows committee. And after the fellows addresses one year, Matt approached me and said, hey,
Hmm.
yeah, I'm really excited about boys and men and your work. And could we do something together? And boy, well, you know what Matt is like. He's
Mhm.
just I mean, I was drawn toward him because he's just such an
Mhm.
energetic, cheerful, pleasant guy, and he's become as prolific as his father. I don't know how he does it, the two of them.
He's got a lot
It's
going
humbling.
on. Yes. Yes.
He does.
I'm
But
I'm
that's
inspired.
that's how we. And shortly thereafter, I got the idea for. I developed a vision to create the most comprehensive series of books on helping boys and men ever published, and I
Mm.
contacted Matt and another buddy, Andy Horn, with whom I had already published a book. He was a world authority on boys and bullying, and I contacted the two of them, and I said, "I wanna start the series, and I wanna kick it off with an edited book titled Counseling Troubled Boys." And I invited them to be my co-editors, and, we became close buddies and co-authors on a number of projects until, sadly, Andy died a couple years ago. But Matt is one of those people I met when he was young. He just took off and far surpassed me, which
And
which was so cool.
that was the '90s, right? That adolescent counseling adolescent boys?
So in 1999, Andy Horn and I published the Handbook of Counseling Boys.
Okay.
was Sage. That had over 30 contributors. But then in
Okay.
2008, we decided too much time had passed, and we went to Routledge with pitching this other book, Counseling Trouble Boys, and that became the first in the series, which now has Ron Levant's book on helping emotionally and expressive men is now the 19th book in the series.
Right.
So Matt and I and Andy did the first book in the series.
Okay. Yeah. I guess I'm just trying to keep the whole timeline in my head because that book came out and then it sounded like there was an update and then your papers followed and then 2010 that was the big paper. Did that was that a big paper for you and Matt? Like did that change things just looking at the response? Was there an initial response to the paper and the publication or was it kind of a
So,
slow burn?
so what happened is Andy, Matt, and I think it was around 2006, put together a multi-person panel at APA on positive masculinity and strength-based psychotherapy with men. And boy, it appealed to a new generation of students and prompted many of those students to start doing their own research on the subject and their own writing on the subject. And gradually, generation after generation started to embrace this. Now, we're
Hmm.
still a minority voice in the field, I think, but we've become recognized.
Yeah.
There was a recent analysis of articles published in it was an analysis of articles published in the Psychology of Men and Masculinity. And in that analysis, Brian, oh God, I'm blocking on his last name, from the University of Kansas. Oh, I'm so embarrassed. His name will come to me in a minute. But he did an analysis and he showed that I think it was 15% or less of the articles in the journal over a span of years were focused on positive issues.
Mm.
But it was more of a presence than had been the case the first, early years in the journal. So we were starting to have an influence. And
Yeah.
Matt's been a great colleague in that journey.
Yeah, I just feel like that paper was kind of a seismic shift, and I guess I just feel so jealous of you and having a little cadre of like-minded clinicians and researchers because I haven't found my tribe yet, but I'm trying to build it with that interest network, and so I'm discovering all these people coming out of the woodwork of they have very similar perspectives and passions and goals in my field, mental health counseling, that I just had no clue people had similar
And,
interests.
and what
So,
what you're doing, Daniel, is so important, and how appropriate that you're the person doing it. Because when I look at your work, for example, your dissertation on positive masculinity, for me was an answer to a prayer. Because I have been writing about this for a while, but there was no measure of positive masculinity. And your dissertation, somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 pages. I mean, it was
mhm.
such a blend of qualitative and quantitative study. That and these many books that you've written, some of which are focused on men, ideally positions you to create in ACA and its related divisions what happened in APA in the mid 1990s. Ron Levant, Gary Brooks, a
Yeah.
number of us, I was part of the original group, started a Division 51, the Society for the Psychological Study of Masculinity. And your interest group parallels what we did as an interest group initially, right? We were a
Yeah.
group of people, men and women, mainly men who were interested in trying to find camaraderie and support. Well,
Grassroots
so there
effort.
was an interest network of Division 17, and some of those people started talking with people in the family division, and in this, I think it's Division 35 is the psychology of women. And Ron and Gary called a meeting at APA. It was an informal meeting of people they knew from these scattered groups to come together and talk. And it led to forming the society first with bylaws and so forth, and then
Hmm.
applying for division membership. And
Hmm.
in spite of the fact that ACA might not favor the creation of a division dedicated to counseling men, boys and men, and there would probably be very, very difficult roadblocks beyond
Hmm.
the reasons you mentioned, right? There are a lot of there are a lot of political issues that get stirred up in this, right? But having
Yeah.
said that, I think as you ask people to spread the word about the interest network, you're going to find eager joiners,
Yeah.
and even if it remains small, finding a group of people who share that passion will be a great service to them and to you. I mean, I feel such gratitude to you discovering you because, as you know, I became an administrator for 15 years, either a dean or a
Hmm.
provost, and my ability to stay current started to drift. And then, as I tried to re-engage, I discovered you, and I thought,
Hmm.
"Wow, this guy
Hmm.
knows so much about what's happening. Is so comprehensive in his thinking." So,
Wow.
and Matt, so
Yeah.
we're part of this same professional family.
Well, for me, it's like I'm inspired by your work, but I'm also just a fan. Like I feel like I'm a fanboy. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but like I just have so much respect for you and Matt, and then Brian McDermott, and just I could give off a huge long list right now of folks who I'm very inspired by and have read their work, and just I feel like it should be a I would love to, just as a pet project, like, just write a history of Division 51. I know there are actually a couple publications out there that kinda tell the story, but just the history of the research in men and masculinity, I find it just endlessly fascinating, and all the characters, and learning about you and Ron Levant and all the host of characters. You're all interesting in your own right, so it's just something that endlessly kinda captures my attention. But I wanna go back to I think this is maybe the 68,000 or $64,000 question. How do you define positive masculinity? How do you see it? What do you distill it into? I know that's been kind of a challenge. I mentioned McDermott just a second ago. He had that paper in 2019 in search of a definition for positive masculinity. And it is a little bit elusive. And we've got, I think, maybe two or three live options of definitions from Wilson, from yourself. I believe there's another definition out there. So how do you conceptualize it? How do you define it? How do you see it?
Yeah, so it's prosocial attitudes and behaviors of men that are expressed in behaviors and attitudes, prosocial behavior and attitudes of men that are expressed in sort of male specific ways, right? So many of the values and the behaviors are not unique to men, right? So both mothers and fathers are protectors, right? Of their children. Many
Right.
many mothers and fathers are both providers. But it's looking at what do these mean to being a man,
Right.
and how when it takes on a certain meaning, does that promote benefits for self and others, right? So for example, one of the things that I was just so grateful to discover after I started about male strengths was to discover this literature on generative fatherhood,
Hmm.
how men care for the next generation, and writings on the benefits that engaged grandfathers provide to their
Hmm.
families. These are very generative fatherhood is a tremendously important concept,
Yeah.
which overlaps with it. To me, it's one of the best expressions of positive masculinity, right? That across countries, across cultures, men are socialized to care for the next generation. They're socialized to sacrifice for the people they love. They're socialized to be providers. And it's not unique to men, but for men, it's so much a part of their identity. And if you look at, for example, the research on teenage fathers, that fatherhood, the the vast majority of boys who become fathers during their teenage years, fatherhood transforms them. It does something to change the way they approach the world. It changes their identity. There is this multifaceted, multi-directional influence of masculinity, fatherhood, mental health. All of these things coalesce in a certain way for boys and men. And so what I've been trying to do is to talk about what is that coming together, and how can it inform our the way we want to socialize boys and the way we want to help boys and men who are struggling.
And maybe just to probe a little, for my own life, I know becoming a father, I have 3 kids. I think it made me aware that I'm not the center of the universe. And in fact, there's these 3 little creatures who are totally dependent on me, and they're really important, they're really valuable. And in order to give them an experience that's positive and healthy and doesn't do damage to them, I'm going to have to locate the highest value from myself to something outside myself. And then it was just kind of like one extension from there on of like, well, yeah, if I care about my kids, then I should also care about the community that they're in, because that's part of caring
Mhm.
for them is caring for the community. And then if I care for my community is nested within an even larger community. And so it was just like this domino effect in my mind happened when I had kids, of becoming more prosocial, I think, which fits really well with that, Dollarhide's work and the generative fatherhood and the involved
Mhm.
fatherhood conception. But I guess the probe would be, outside of fatherhood, is there positive masculinity? Because not every man's going to become a father.
Right.
Is it independent of fatherhood? I guess that's my question to you. Is positive masculinity independent of fatherhood?
Yeah. I have no doubt that it is, right? Not every person goes on to be a father. And so, you know, when boys and men are raised with the belief that you you have a right to you have an obligation to contribute to society. You have an obligation to support your family, even if you're not a father. You have an obligation to work hard, to sacrifice, to protect others, to stand up
Mhm.
for what's right. Now that's not unique. That's not unique to masculinity, but it tends to get expressed in certain male specific ways, right? And it's modeled from one generation to the next, and then it's repeated from that generation to the next generation.
Right.
By the way, I just looked up and remembered the name, with apologies to our good colleague Brian Cole, who's the
Oh,
person who did
Cole,
that
yes.
analysis.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Brian Cole, who did
So
that
much good work.
analysis of the psychology of men and masculinity
Yes.
literature. So I apologize to Brian if he's ever going to watch this. That for a moment I forgot his name, but yeah. So
Yeah.
positive masculinity is not limited to males who become fathers.
Yeah. Okay. And that's a good point. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there with recalling Cole, which is we needed to do that. So, um, but I think I'm trying to
Well,
get my
you're
brain.
we were talking about is positive masculinity limited to fatherhood?
Okay. Yes. Thank you
And,
for
and Yeah.
prompting some of my thoughts there. So I think a big influence. You're making me think of Seligman's work because he, positive psychology, and looking at virtues. And you're totally right. There's nothing exclusive about the virtues or positive psychology, or what is it called? Positive personality traits. So there's nothing unique about there's nothing gender specific about those, right? All genders are equal participants in those traits, but I do think there is a masculine signature, if you will, on some of those traits.
Yes,
And so
that's a good way to put it. Mhm.
it makes me think of your work in 2010, which is, if you look at those lists of those 10 virtues or those 10 strengths, you take out the male, and I think you had things like, relational styles, heroism, humor, those kinds of things. But then you added the male, and there's something about that that just unlocked things of like, oh, these are virtues and these are strengths in their own right, but there is a unique masculine signature or dimension to those of me being male and seeing myself as a man and having my own masculinity and the cultural conversation and all that stuff. It's bringing something to that virtue. There's a unique part of my masculinity that's interacting with that virtue that's kind of an emergent property, so to speak. Maybe one layer to this would be is I'm very influenced by Carl Rogers and his work on making meaning or meaning making, right? And so it seems like me as a man, I'm making meaning in a male specific way of that virtue or of that strength that is consistent with other men, not only within my time and my culture, but it seems across culture too. Not to make too big of a statement or too bold of a statement, but it does seem like there are some kind of universal male specific meaning made of those strengths that do extend beyond me, beyond this era and time that I'm living in, that kind of, you can see it through literature. I think of the work, this figured really prominently in my dissertation, but the work of Caballerismo, and I'm butchering that.
Yes, yes, yes. Very good example. Yeah.
But the work of Arcienega and a couple other names that come to mind, but there's a rich history of chivalry and nobility among men of
Mhm.
standing up for your community, and being protective of your community and investing in your community. There's a rich history in Spanish culture, and so it was almost more of a literary analysis of the historical record and of literature of these male prosocial strength-based elements, and then they went and did the empirical research and looking into
Mhm.
machismo, behaviorismo. And so for me, that was a line of research that was like, there's already research on this that's empirical and has a measurement and is looking at, what are the correlates of these different masculinity conceptions. And so I apologize for shotgunning you there, Mark, with so many thoughts, but I'm really restraining myself, not just launching into a million different threads with everything that you're saying. So I don't know if any of that makes sense. I probably brought up like four different separate topics there, but yeah, anything stand out to you from that?
Well, so let me just share one reaction because what you said is so timely because you talked about your impression is there's potentially something universal in this, right? And although I think we could always find exceptions to some of the things that I've claimed in terms of how many countries and cultures do they cut across, I'm currently I just finished a book chapter for a book called The Forgotten Realities of Men. It was
Hmm.
just published. University of British Columbia Press and University of Chicago Press are putting out this book, and it's the editors are a fabulous team of scholars from Canada. And I looked at teenage fatherhood across countries for any literature I could find, and I'm now co-editing a book with some colleagues from the United Kingdom on international
Oh, wow.
perspectives on young fathers. And what I have found by writing the chapter for the first book, and now as the editor of the second book, is that if you go across countries and you find a young man who's become a father as a teenager, if he cannot be a provider, he doesn't feel like a man.
Hmm.
And if he is not a provider, in so many countries, for understandable reasons, but perhaps at the same time not recognizing the complexity of the situation, the mother and her family will not consider him a man.
Hmm.
They they
The
view
mother and the family.
the mother of the child of his baby and her kinship network. If he cannot be a provider, that is, if he can't financially provide,
Yes.
he's often not considered worthy of being called a man. And this is very frustrating to these young men who come from poverty, who've suffered abuse, who are at disadvantage, who are marginalized. Thwarting their efforts to be a provider affects how they view themselves
Yeah.
and is such a violation of this global expectation a
Mhm.
father is a provider, right? So
Mhm.
there is something universal to this, even though fathers, many mothers are providers, right? But it
Yeah.
is so central to how one views oneself as a
Yeah.
man across the world.
Yeah.
So we find that one of the big challenges is trying to figure out how to help these guys be providers,
Right.
or to witness how they step forward to provide in other ways, right?
And if
You
I
know,
can just jump in with a comment, Mark,
yeah,
and when I use the term universal, y I added a couple tentative language, something like universal, and the reason I did
yes,
that
yes,
is because and I'm sure, it came to your mind too, is the essentialism, the issue of essentialism.
yes,
You know, I
yes,
if you're to say a trait is exclusively male, it's just kind of implausible because, of course, women have as much access to heroism and protectiveness as any man does. So, obviously, an essentialist paradigm is problematic for a number of reasons. However, though, I'm very influenced by evolutionary psychology with the work of David Buss and John Archer. And if you look at some of Buss's research, his research, his data set is huge, enormous, multiple nations, massive samples. And so I remember reading his textbook, and I was looking at essentially a very quick and dirty list of what are the female sexual preferences in men. So the preferences
yes,
that women have when they're, for mate selection. And it was essentially resource sharing, violent, not towards her or the offspring, but towards predators and, a warring tribe or an outside tribe, but fidelity. So, he wasn't off procreating elsewhere. And so it was essentially, I looked at those traits and those characteristics of what Buss had described as the traits that women are selecting for. And they just, to me, it was like, this is positive masculinity, someone who's protective, who has paternal investment in offspring, shares resources, is violent to predators, but not to his female mate and to the offspring, and a whole big long list too. But to me, it was just like, this is maybe this is something that is universal in a sense because it's been undergoing, hundreds of thousands of evolutionary history in its making. And then when you take into account, well, there's also another selective pressure, which is male competition too. So then males are competing with other males for female mates. And so they're having to be violent with them and compete and, seek status and drive for success and all those types of things. And to me, in my mind, it was like, this really maps onto some of the things that Ron Levon is talking about, which is, how many partners can I secure? How can I pursue status and in my own enrichment, essentially? The female mate selection is kind of like, how can I enrich my mate and my offspring and my community and protect them? Male to male competitions, like, how can I enrich myself and be superior and dominant over other males? Obviously for like access to females and in that kind of paradigm. But it just seemed to me like there's those two selective pressures going on, which are shaping male traits that seem to offer some kind of explanation for maybe some of the problematic aspects of traditional masculinity, but also some of the positive, health promoting, prosocial aspects we see in positive masculinity. So it's very half baked, and I'm just kind of formulating some of my thoughts on that. But in my mind, that does reach kind of I'm not suggesting an essentialist point of view, but something that does speak to a universal aspect where we see this cross-culturally over time, particular male patterns of behavior that are, I think, are prosocial and health promoting, but also has a dark side to it if things aren't kept in check or in balance. And I think culture, depending on what culture you're in, can promote one side or the other, can be more of a facilitator for one or the other. And so I think there's a lot of cultural dimensions to this as well, outside of just kind of evolutionary forces directing the emergence of certain traits. So that's totally half baked but your comments, where you were talking about you're seeing certain things across culture in terms of young fathers, I see a conceptual overlay there with evolutionary psychology and positive psychology too, with the work of Martin Seligman.
So perhaps we can make this particular topic our concluding one for this conversation. But let me react to what you said, Daniel. First off, that is very important research. The results of Buss and others on evolutionary psychology, and it overlaps those findings that you just mentioned, which I think are very informative, right, about understanding men and masculinity. Those findings overlap considerably with the findings on across different cultural, racial, ethnic groups in the United States, what the communities consider the qualities of positive male role models. So back in the early 90s, when I was writing my first book on teenage fathers, I decided to write, the title was Multicultural Counseling with Teenage Fathers, because I felt the path to and the response to fatherhood is shaped by culture, right? So if we're going to help these young guys, let's try to consider the cultural context in which it occurs. And some of the experts on helping argue that one way to help is to provide them with father mentors and role models in the community. So if we're going to do that, then what are the qualities of these model mentors, right? The literature was quite clear, and it's consistent with some of the things you just said about evolutionary psychology and about positive masculinity that I've just written about, that they're people who are honest, they're respected, they stand up for others, they have confidence in themselves, they're willing to teach others and share their wisdom. They are considered respected providers in their community, humanitarians, all of these admirable qualities and virtues. So it brings us back to what we were talking about earlier, and I have so much enjoyed the various directions we've gone in this conversation today.
Absolutely. And we can wrap up, Mark, and I just so appreciate your time. And I think just maybe one more thought on that is, I think why I gravitate to those perspectives is looking for something that's more causal. What causes, if positive masculinity is a thing, what causes it versus just a mere description of it. And so I think that's the evolutionary psychology gives a potential explanation for it in a causal pathway. So that's why I guess I'm curious of looking into it. But anyway, I just want to say thank you so much for giving me your time and letting me pepper you with all these questions. And if you're open to it, I'd love to chat with you again and go into some more depth with some of these things, because I think we only scratched the surface. There's so much more here. But yeah, with that we can wrap up. And yeah, any final thoughts or concluding thoughts from you?
Well, my concluding thought is how grateful I am that you started the Interest Network, which is, I think how we connected for the first time, although I had already read your dissertation. So I want to repeat what I said earlier, that first off, I'm grateful, I'm honored that you're interested in interviewing me. This has been a great conversation, and I look forward to our continued um, participation in the Interest Network. And I know what you talked about being a fan of mine, and I am certainly a fan of yours. And I have every confidence that because of our mutual interest, we are destined to present and publish together at some point. And I look forward to that, as well as our growing friendship.
Oh, that would be a dream come true. So yes, I will do everything in my power to make sure that happens. So that would be amazing. All right. Well,
All right,
thanks,
my
Mark.
friend. This has been
Absolutely.
a treat. Thanks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate your time, and I'll hopefully talk with you soon.
All right. Have a
All
good
right.
night.
Thanks for listening to the Men's Mental Health Podcast with Dr. Daniel Bates. If today's conversation resonated with you, tap follow and share the episode with someone who could use it. Every episode is on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and watch bonus clips on YouTube. Just search Dr. Daniel Bates, PhD. For show notes, free resources, and ways to learn more about Dr. Bates' research, visit drdanielbates.com. And if you enjoy deeper dives, subscribe to our Substack, Men's Mental Health at Counselor Dan. Remember, asking and receiving help is a strength, not a weakness. Until next time, take care of yourself and the men in your life.